Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Lamed. Hey, Zevachim 35. We're going to start on 34b, 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara says, Gufa. Gufa always introduces a previous statement from the Gemara. So we're picking up with what we finished yesterday, that Rabbi Yehuda's of the position that if something is pushed off, if it's dichoy, then it's pushed off. But if it's biyado, if you have the ability to fix it with your own ability, then it's not dichoy. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we have a brisa from about the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach was brought on the eve of Pesach, and there were so many lambs that were brought that day that the courtyard became filled with blood. The courtyard of the temple. So Rabbi Yehuda says, at the end of the day, they would pick up one. Cup of blood from the floor, that from all the blood that became mixed in, and they would pour it on the altar, because because they're worried that if one of the blood of the would fall off of the cups where they're bringing to the altar, you have to take the blood and spill it on the altar. But let's say one of the cups of blood would spill, so they would anyways at the end of the day pick up some blood from the floor, and this way they would make it kosher for that animal. So Amru Lo Rabbi Yehuda. So the sages responded to Rabbi Yehuda, but how does that help? But that blood had fallen straight to the floor, so it had him. If the blood goes straight to the floor before being collected in a utensil, it's disqualified. So you can't lift it up from the floor. So the Rabbi Yehuda responds, Minayade, how do you know it didn't first hit the floor? It first go into utensil and then spill out. So the rabbi said, how can you pick up the blood from the floor? It doesn't do anything by pouring on the altar. Maybe it was not received in the utensil. So Amar Lahen, so Rabbi Yehuda responded to them, no, I was saying, I wasn't on top of 35a. I wasn't saying you could pick this up if the blood never hits the floor. If it never hit a utensil first. I was saying where it hit a utensil and then fell out onto the ground. And then to make sure that everybody fulfilled their obligation, the rabbis at the end will take up some blood from the floor and pour it in on the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, "Who gufe?" But how does Rabbi Yehuda Minayade? How does he know that the blood was first collected in the utensil and then fell on the floor? How does he even know that? So the Gemara's answer is Kohanim's reason. Look at Yossi. Look how zealous he is. He's always the first one here in the morning. The Kohanim's reason. The Kohanim are dedicated. They're not going to let give this to our friend Harold. Give this to our friend Harold. Baruch Hashem. Kohanim are reason. They're very dedicated to their task. They're not going to allow anything to spill onto the floor before it goes into their utensil. We're on 35a, third line. Mara says, so if that's the case, how does it end up on the floor? Because because they're in their dedication to do the service so quickly, it's going to spill. But they would always make sure that they collect it first. Mara says, but still, how could you pick up the blood from the floor and pour it onto the altar? Valo, it's not just the blood of the animal that's called the dama nefesh. That's the blood that's supposed to go onto the altar that you're supposed to pour on. But after that blood comes out, there's other blood that comes out, which trickles out. That's called the dama tamsis. And that's not supposed to go on the altar. Valo dama tamsis muravbo. But isn't there other blood there as well, the dama tamsis? So how could he be pouring them both on the altar? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda with Tamei. Now Rabbi Yehuda followed this position. The Amar dama tamsis kari dam. Rabbi Yehuda says, you had a question, Bill? The dama nefesh is the one that comes out with a force, and then after that slows down. Then there's a secondary blood that comes out that's called the dama tamsis. And the dama nefesh is the blood that's supposed to be poured on the altar, and the dama tamtis is not. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda tamei damar dama tamtis karidam. No, Rabbi Yehuda says dama tamtis is also blood, not just dama nefesh. Dayan dama tamtis ba'azhara, Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'kares. And Rabbi Yehuda's other position that dama tamtis, if you eat it, is also excuse me, the rabbis say it's just a prohibition. Rabbi Yehuda says it's like regular blood, and you get kares for eating it. Where it says, "V'amar Rabbi Lazar, Moder Rabbi Yehuda Inyan Kapar She'enu Mechaber." But doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say that it doesn't serve as an atonement? Even though he says you can't eat the damatamtis, he says that you do pour it on the altar. That if you pour it on the altar, it doesn't work. Shenemer dam shenefesh yotze bo koridon. She'ena nefesh yotze bo ein koridon. It's not effective to achieve atonement. So if it gets mixed up with the dam and nefesh, you have a problem. Ella Rabbi Yehuda Latame. Rabbi Yehuda says, follows his logic, the Amar Ein Dam Mevatel Dam. He says, this is the concept from Yoredeya, it's the concept Mimba Mino Lo Batel. Two like items do not nullify each other. So since they're both blood, he says the Dama Tamtis is not going to nullify the Dama Nefesh. So the Dama Nefesh is still there. The Dama Tamtis will be poured on. It doesn't really solve the whole problem, but the Dama Tamtis is still being poured on the altar. But apparently that's isn't there dam pasul still mixed in? So they say, so Tosfos asked that question, and he says that Rabbi Yehuda must hold like Rabbi Lazar, who says that since you weren't sprinkling it for the purpose of a kapara, we look at it as though it's mayim and though it's not there. That's one answer, or maybe a different answer that he says if the dam and tamsis is mixed in, it'll be kosher. Anyway, that's the point. He says the dam and nefesh is not nullified by the dam and tamsis. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says, "L'divrei, according to your opinion, that they wouldn't pick up the blood that's spilled on the ground and pour it on the altar." Well, if that's the case, we're on 35a, around 10 lines down. So it says Rabbi Yehuda, according to you the Chacham, remember, Rabbi Yehuda said we're supposed to pick up blood that falls on the courtyard floor and pour it on the base of the altar, just to make sure that everybody had their blood sprinkled from their animal. But according to you, Chachamim will say you don't do this. Lama pokakina zara. Why did they close up the irrigation system in the courtyard? There was a drainage system which prevented the blood from flowing out into the Nachal Kidron. And why did they do that if there was no point? They weren't going to pick up that blood. So why did the rabbis? And everybody agrees that they did that. And the sages said the reason why they did that is. Listen to this line. The lines like this is what you'll never forget. And this is what the tragedy of people don't do Daf Yomi, they'll never see lines like this. Because what school is going to study Zevachim 35a? Very few schools. I mean, yeah, you could get it in Pesachim 65b, but usually you don't do that parak also in Pesachim. So he says, why? They closed it up just so it would be praiseworthy for the children of Aaron when they did their service, when the Kohanim did their service on Erev Pesach, they'd be walking up to their knees in blood to show how much they loved serving Hashem, even though they're not disgusted by the amount of blood. So it's also very deeply symbolic. And if the Kohanim want to serve in the temple, they have to recognize that they're walking on the blood. They're walking on blood. What blood? The blood of those who sacrificed so that we could be here today. So the Gemara says, "V'adam havechatzitza." But how can you walk on the blood? Isn't the blood an interposition between the legs of the Kohanim and the floor? The Gemara says, "Lachu." No, it's moist. It's only chatzitza when it's dry. The Tanan Adam v'adio. Anybody know what dio is? That's the ink that we use for ink is called dio. V'advash and honey, v'cholav and milk. The Yevation, if they're dry, chotetzin, it serves as a barrier. But lachem, if they're moist, ain't chotetzin. It's not going to serve as a barrier. Gemara says, still it's a problem. Why? Isn't their clothing getting dirty from the blood? You're not to serve in the temple with dirty clothing. So the Gemara answers, the Gemara first suggests, the model, if you want to say they lifted up their clothing when they served so it didn't get bloody, that wouldn't work. Vadanya, mido, kemida so, we had this already in our Gemara, that you can't be too high or too low. So the Gemara says, okay, they lifted it up, they only lifted it up, or maybe it was basically that they didn't walk through the blood when they were wearing their garments. They only did it when they were walking through to carry the limbs to the altar, and that was not considered avodah, and so therefore they didn't need the garments of the Kohanim. So therefore, if it was dirty or if it was too high, it wasn't a problem. Really, that is a service, carrying the limbs to the ramp of the altar. No, that means they didn't have to worry when they were carrying the wood to the fire. That's not a service. So they would walk through the blood when they're carrying the wood to the fire of the mizbeach. Gemara says, but since it's blood all over the place, how did they do the service in the temple? The Gemara says, Azliya it's to be. They put stones like footstones there, and they walked on the stones, and that way the blood didn't get on their clothing. You see how much blood was flowing that day in the court of the temple, because maybe, according to Gemara Pesachim, there maybe was 1 million sacrifices that day. All the lambs were they had an assembly line. It was a very busy day at the temple. Obviously, the busiest day of the year. Okay, everybody got that? Okay, so now we're up to the next Mishnah. So let's say you slaughtered the animal, the carbon, with the intent to eat beyond the proper time or beyond the proper place, which is typically speaking a pigul disqualifying thought, but to eat something that you don't typically eat, meaning to say the emurim where the parts are supposed to be burnt, or to burn, or to offer on the altar something you don't typically do, which is the meat. Meaning to say you had the improper thought, but about something that we're not sure if it should be disqualifying. So therefore, kosher. Therefore, the carbon is kosher because the improper thought of beyond the time and place was about something that was itself done wrong. And so because you're allowed to, because you're not allowed to bring the meat on the altar, so therefore the thought was not disqualifying. Rabbi Elazar posel, but Rabbi Elazar disqualifies. We've seen this now 3 or 4 times in our tractate. Because Rabbi Elazar is of the position that even though you're going from achilos adam to achilos hamizbeach, from the eating of man to the eating of the altar, it's still going to disqualify. Let's say you had a thought to eat beyond the proper time, something that you typically eat, but it was pachos mikazais, but the thought it was about something less than an outsized amount. And then we're going to say kosher. We're going to say it's kosher under those circumstances. Let's say you had in mind to, beyond the proper time, to eat less half an olive and to burn on the altar half an olive. Again, kosher. And the eating and the burning don't combine. Let's say when you slaughter the animal, you have intent to eat beyond the proper time an olive-sized amount of the skin, umina rotev, or the sauce, umina kipa. This is the sauce that's mixed with the spices, umina halal. Some say this is like a tendon in the neck of the animal. It's not edible. It's very hard. And umina tzamos, from the bones, umina gidin, umina karnayim, umina tlafim, from the horns or the hooves. Kosher. It's kosher, even though the thought was beyond the proper time, beyond the proper place. Because since these are things that are not edible, therefore the improper thought about them does not disqualify. Do you have a question, Bill? And then if in the end you bring the carbon and you eat the meat, you're not going to be liable for pigul. And also, if the carbon was pigul, And then if you eat the meat, you would get kares. But you ate these things, you ate the hooves, then you don't get kares because this is not considered pigul. It is not considered eating. And also, we know you're not allowed to eat the meat beyond the expired time. And that's called noser. And if you eat meat beyond the proper time, you get kares. But if you eat these things, you don't get kares. Vitame, and you're not liable if you're tame and you eat them. Normally, you would get kares if you eat the carbon while you're tame. But if you eat the hooves, for example, you're not getting kares. You had a question, Jeff?
Be like
Yeah, so the Gemara is going to discuss that a little bit, but yeah, it's also this is repetitive a little bit. We've seen a lot of this before. Yeah, when that happens, the Gemara usually says tzricha. Why do we need all these cases? Let's say you slaughter hektish, but you slaughter a female animal, le'achol shalil, to eat its fetus, meaning to say beyond the proper time, beyond the proper place, but to eat the fetus, or shilya, or the shilya is the placenta. Do you know what the placenta is, Yossi? Proud of you. Very proud of you. Or a bachut. And if you do this beyond the proper time or beyond the proper place, low figo, it does not make the carbon pigul with this thought, and it's kosher because the fetus and the placenta are disgusting to eat, and people don't eat them, so it's not called the manner of eating. Hamoikes atorin, let's say you do malika, that's with the process of slaughtering the animal, but it's not with a knife, but with your thumb in the back of the neck. Lechol beitzeim bechutz, to eat the eggs of the animal beyond the proper time or place of the bird, of the dove, lo pigo. And that's not called pigo because that's not from the actual carbon itself. Chalav muktash, and ubeitze torin, let's say you have the milk of the female animal, and the eggs of the dove, ein chayavin alem mishum pigul. So too, if you eat them when the carbon was pigul, you're not liable. Vinoser, and you're also not liable for eating it beyond the proper time. Vitame, or if you're tame. So Amar Rabbi Elazar says, pigul bezevach, that let's say you slaughtered the carbon with the intent to eat it beyond the proper time. This pagel shalil. Then we're going to say that the shalil, the fetus, becomes pigul, and therefore, if you eat the fetus, you're liable for kares. But bishalil, but let's say you had the thought about the shalil initially, say I'm going to eat the fetus beyond the proper time, lo nispagel at zevach. Then the carbon has not become pigul. Okay, let me just say this again. If the carbon was pigul and you ate the fetus, you're not going to get kares because the fetus is not going to be considered part of the meat of the animal. But let's say you had the improper thought about pigul is improper thought to eat something beyond the proper time, and you said at the beginning, at the outset, I'm going to eat the fetus beyond the proper time when I'm allowed to eat this carbon. Then, excuse me, if you're pigul bezevach, the first case was if you had the thought and the animal's pigul and you ate the fetus, that's considered pigul and you're liable for kares. But if you said I'm going to eat the fetus beyond the proper time, then the carbon does not become pigul. So it's seemingly a contradictory idea. The fetus can make the animal pigul, but you won't be liable for kares for eating that pigul. What, the fetus? If the fetus is inside the animal when it's slaughtered, then it's kosher. Yeah. So, what? What did you say? That's where he's not talking about an animal that comes out alive. He's talking about that it was found dead. So, pigo balal. And so too, if he had the thought about eating like this tendon on the neck, then nispagua mura, and then we're going to say if he had the thought about the eating the tendon on the neck beyond the proper time, which is edible, then nispagua mura, and also he had the thought about the mura, which is the I think they call it the gizzard. I don't know how they translate it. Maybe the intestines. What?
Crop.
Or the crop. The crop is the part of the bird where they basically store the food until they digest it down. So then if you eat the mura, you're going to be liable for kares. But if you had the improper thought about the crop, then you eat the well, you're not liable for kares. And Rabbi Lezer continues, pigo be'emurin. If you have the improper thought about the emurin, this pagu parim, then the whole cow is going to be, even the meat is going to be liable for kares. But if you had the thought about the cows, then this pagu emurin, then the emurim are not disqualified. So this will bring a proof for Rabbi Eliezer's position that just because there's a part that you can make pigu on doesn't mean that if you eat that part, you're going to be liable for kares. If it was, if you had the pigu stuff from something else, let's bring a proof for him for this position. The Brisa says v'shavim. It's the Brisa that says that the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon agree. We're going to get to this mission of Mem Gimel that the Rabbanan say that the law of pigo applies by cows that are burned, and Rabbi Shimon says that the law of pigo doesn't apply to them because their blood is not sprinkled on their altar. So we learned v'shavim she'im chishev b'achilos parim ubisreifasan lo asav lo klum, that if he thought about one of the avodas of the blood about eating the cow, or to burn them the next day properly, will also lokum. He's done nothing because the intent to eat it does not disqualify them because this is something that's not typically eaten, and the intent to burn them also doesn't disqualify them because only the burning of the parts on the altar is what's considered achila. So the Gemara says, "My love, what are we talking about in that case? Ha chishev beimurim v'nispagu parim. Aren't we talking about a case? We're talking about only in that case where he thought to eat the cows, and then it's not going to make it a pigo. He thought to eat the meat. But if he thought to eat the limbs and the spago parim, then we would say that it would be liable for kares. And that's like Rabbi Lazar. The Gemara says, no, that's not the proper deal. Well, no, it's just teaching us that if the emurim were the pigo thought, then the emurim themselves, if you eat, you'd be liable for pigo. The Gemara says, let's bring a different intent on top of 35b for Rabbi Eliezer, a different intent. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says as follows. Tashma, we learn in the Mishnah Mi'ila, Param anisrafim, Usir manisrafim. Let's say you have the cow that are supposed to be burned and the goats that are supposed to be burned. What's the cow that's burned? That's the here we're talking about the cow that's supposed to be burned is the cow that we're referring to is if we had in Horios, if the community made a mistake on the basis of a benthim, and the seirim that are supposed to be burned, that's the goat of Avodah Zarah. If everybody, again, if the court made a ruling, so molam ben mishuk dashu, that if you benefit from them after they were consecrated, you have to bring a korban mi'ila. But once they're slaughtered, we pasel b'tvul yom. Then if a tvul yom touches them, then they're going to become disqualified. Ube mechusar kippurim, or if a mechusar kippurim touches them, ubelina, or if they left overnight. So we say, my lav linas basar. Are we talking about if the meat was left overnight? Ushmamina migu de pasel belina, pasel b'machshava. And so don't we want to say that since they're disqualified through being left overnight, they're also going to be disqualified about the process of thinking about leaving them overnight. And that is chutzos mano of the imurim. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actual linas imurim. actually leaving them overnight. But the meat of the cow itself would not be disqualified by leaving overnight. And so therefore we can't learn from here that you could also disqualify with pigol. The Gemara says, but Amidictani Sefer, Molim Bainal Beis Adeshin, Ache Yutacha Basar, that you can commit mi'ila with them in the place where they're burnt outside until they're burnt. We call the ratio Linas Basar. Isn't the first called Linas Basar? The Gemara says, no, midi area, it's not the same case. Hakadisa, Resha Be'imurim, the Sefer Basar. The first cause is the Imurim, and the latter cause of the meat. So the Gemara brings another attempt to challenge Rabbi Elazar that the fetus and the placenta can become pigol with the carbon. Mesiv Rabba ve'elu she'em mefaglim. These are those things that if a person sought to eat them or to burn them after their time, does not ruin the carbon. Ve'ein mispaglim, and also the laws of pigol don't apply to them. The wool on the head of the sheep, and the hair in the beard of the goat, or in the skin, and it says explicitly the shalil and the shilya and the chalav of the mukdash and the milk, and also you're not liable for a tummy that if you ate them while you're tummy, and also if you bring them outside, you're exempt. So it says specifically, doesn't mean that they don't make the carbon if you had a thought to eat them into pigol. And if you eat them, you're not liable for kares. Isn't that a direct proof against Rabbi Eliezer? The Gemara says no. No, they don't make the carbon pigol, but also if you sprinkled mispagon machmas asman, which means that if you sprinkle blood with the intent to eat them outside, then it doesn't become, they don't make the carbon pigol. That's not going to be considered machshava. But if the carbon became pigol and you ate them, that would be liable for kares. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, how the katani seifa kuan wa mefaglin wa mispaglin, when it says in the conclusion of the price that all of them are not mefaglin but mispaglin, asulamli, why is it being repeated? The Gemara says, "Otameich," and according to your logic, ein chayavin alav mishum pigol hasulamli. Also, that phrase is extra. Ella idi debayla misna nosar v'tamei, since it wants to include the categories of nosar and tamei of leftover meat. And somebody who's tamei, tana pigol, hachanami, I did the Bible misname, alaman b'chutz, tanami kulam mispaglim. Meaning, say it's just the style of the Mishnah. Rava says, I'll prove like Rabbi Eliezer from our Mishnah, and that's how we get to all this because it comes back to our Mishnah. Afanad nami tinina shochet at the mukdashin. If you slaughter the female animal, achol shalil shilya b'chutz, to eat the meat beyond the proper time, lo pigol. Then the carbon does not become pigol. Or if you do the mulika on the birds to eat their eggs, lo pigol. And then it says, and then it says you're not liable for pigol for the birds, no sartame. Which implies that you would be liable for eating the fetus and the placenta. So one is that if you thought to eat from this meat of the carbon itself, then also the fetus and the placenta would become considered to be pigol. Vikan, and that which we said it's not pigol is if you thought from the beginning to eat this meat, then the whole carbon will not become pigol. Shmamina. So the Gemara says, Tanan Asam, Bali, we learned in our Mishnah that even though the Mizbeach is Mekadesh the Psulim, the Mizbeach can make those who are those animals that are disqualified, something that went up on it will not go down. There are some disqualifications that we don't say this law about, that even if they went up, they have to go down. And what are the examples we learned about that? An animal that was engaged in sexual acts with a human being. And also Bali Mumin, an animal that has a blemish. Rabbi Akiva Machshir Bali Mumin. Rabbi Akiva says if the animal has a blemish, it stays up. doesn't go off the altar. Rabbi Akiva only allowed the blemishes to stay up if it was a cataract in the eye. Where else do we have this phrase dukin shaba'ayin? That for us it's a blemish, but for them it's not. Remember where we had that in Gittin, which is a story in Gittin. He wanted to make a mum on the animal, and so he made a mum that was a cataract in the eye for us, but not for them. Remember Bar Kamsa? He made a blemish in the animal. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva says that if it's a cataract in the eye, it stays up on the altar and doesn't come down. Whole ksherim ba'ofas, because bird, that's not a disqualifying feature. Musha kadam viktishan et mumam, and that's only where he consecrated before they got the blemish. Moder Rabbi Akiva ba'olas nekeva, and Rabbi Akiva would admit by an olah of a female to command the kadam muma laktisha dami, that it's like the blemish came before it was consecrated, and it should go down. And even though a nekeva is kosher by a olas ha'of, but with respect to an animal of a nekeva, it's as though the blemish came beforehand, because an olah only comes from a male. So if it was a female, it for sure goes down. Masav Rabbi Zera, so Rabbi Zera challenges this from the previous brisa, Malaman b'chutz pater, that if you take these animals and you bring up this part of the animal outside the courtyard, it's going to be exempt. So meaning to say, if you bring the shoil, the fetus, outside the courtyard of the temple, you're exempt, because that's not something typically brought. Me'iman, but if you slaughtered its mother, chayiv, you're liable. How? It's obviously the case, but olas nekeva, aren't we talking about a female olah? And that if you brought outside, you're liable. The Amrit B'Shalom Rabbi Akiva olas nekeva also lo tered. If you say Rabbi Akiva admits by an olah nekeva, Hamani, would you say that this price is Rabbi Akiva? It can't be. So Ella Yamris am also tered Hamani. So if that's the case, if you say even Rabbi Akiva admits by an olas nekeva, and if it goes up, if he said if I'm also tered. So who's the one who says that? So the Gemara says Ema Malaman b'chutz pater. I mean Murim chayiv. No, yeah, if you bring the animal itself, you'll be exempt. But if you bring the limbs, the emurim, the parts of it, you'll be liable. Gemara says V'amei henkatani. It says from them. So Iman dumya didayu. And the mother is similar to them. No, if you bring from the imurim, their imurim, if you brought the fats of the fetus outside, then you'll be exempt. But if you brought from the innards of the mother, you'll be liable. And we're talking about a chatas or a shlomim that come from a female. I will stop here for today's daf. Shkoyach. This afternoon, we'll do the daf at 1:30.